about working on the fuel tank. I've started turning up the flange on the first one of these end pieces or baffle, and I just did this with my slotted stick, sort of in there, and pulled it up. And if that's not long enough, you can do the exact same thing with a adjustable spanner. Each of these little ripples here shows kind of where you have to shrink the metal. So now I've got this most of the way up. I can probably now just use this and a hammer and start shrinking these things into each other. I did originally think I was going to do it kind of as a hammer form thing, but I think just doing it like this is going to work. You can see though how pulling this edge up makes the base of this go wobbly. So we'll sort that out afterwards, I think. I've been going around finishing this one off with this dolly. Again, it's got a good shape on it. It's not 90 degrees, it's a little bit more, which helps for me to hammer this and get it to 90 degrees. If it was at 90 degrees, I wouldn't be able to get it all the way, if that makes sense. So just tightening this up, making sure it's sitting flat. There's no little tiny bit of rock on it, but it's pretty flat. The corner on the outside isn't quite as tight. It's more noticeable here that it's not perfect, but that doesn't matter because that's on the inside of the tank. Ooh. So you won't actually see that. What you'll see from the outside is this, and once this is trimmed and welded and painted, you're not going to notice that. Also, when it's in the car, of course, the fuel tank sits down in there like that, so it'll be like that, I guess. You can't even really see it anyway, so that should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and do similar on this one. Just tighten this corner up, straighten up this flange, get it nice, get it at 90 degrees, and I'll probably do the baffle another day. I don't really have to do a flange all the way around on the baffle. I could just do little tabs, I guess, but it's probably nicer to do a full flange, push it into the middle of the tank, and I'll plug weld from the inside to stick that to the outside of the tank. Been finishing these up a bit. I've laid them back to back just to see how close they are to each other, and they're pretty close. There's a few places where it's not quite right, but that could be because the flanges aren't at exactly 90 degrees, and also I haven't trimmed them yet. But the overall height and the overall width are pretty much exactly the same, so that's pretty good. What I will do next tomorrow, that needs a little bit of flattening maybe, is I'll weight this down with something, probably to make sure it's sitting flat, and then I will mark a line around it. I'll sit the pencil on top of something that gives me the right height, and then I will mark a line all the way around to give me an even flange, and then I'll just trim that by hand. And that should give me the two end caps for the petrol tank. And then I'm going to have to look at rolling this. Now I'm hoping I can do this on my slip rolls over there. I should be able to. It's narrow enough. I may need to bring those over here again. So I've got room to do it. But yeah, they've come out okay, I think. The other thing I might do is, one, I've run out of TIG welding gas, argon, so I need to get some more argon. When I go up to the engineering shop, I might see if they've got some weld through zinc primer, and I'll probably give these a coat of that before I before I actually welded the tank together. The tank also gets sealed, and for that I use it's called Red Coat Sealer, which is over here. So I use this on the Austin 7 tank, various other little petrol cans that I've been using for a few years now, and it works well. It comes as a dry powder, it's red, and you dissolve it with acetone. You sort of thin it down with acetone, and then you tip it into the tank, swirl it round so it coats everything, and tip it out again. You can do multiple coats. What I like about this stuff is acetone will always dissolve it. So petrol won't, E85 fuel won't, I'm guessing just normal alcohols or anything like that won't, but you can always rinse it out with acetone, it'll redissolve it. And I like that. I know other people talk about POR 15 and things, but it's like an isocyanate cure thing. It's a moisture cure product, and what I've found with that in the past is if it doesn't stick to the metal, it'll cure and then it'll peel off in sheets, and you really don't want that inside a petrol tank. So I'm going to stick to the red coat. Don't know where I think it's in the back of the Austin, the little fuel can that I did with it. I also used it on my KT250 tank, and that sealed that up perfectly, and also the tank for the Valasette. You can sort of see some of it in there. Seems like good stuff. So that's what I'll do to this fuel tank as well. I may need to get more of it. I can't remember how much that coats, but I've done, like I say, a number of tanks and little petrol cans now, so it may be worth getting another container load of that stuff just to make sure I've got enough. The volume of the tank, I did work it out. It's I think it was 33 litres. So you can figure out the gallons yourself for that, because it's different. Gallons are different in the UK and the US. I can never remember which is which. So I think that's where I'm going to stop for the night. Out in the shed again, but tonight, instead of bashing this bit of metal or these bits of metal, I decided to bash this bit of metal instead, which is the little piece that goes underneath the rear axle. That was just a circular piece of steel, and I did start wheeling it out, but I realized that was going to take far too long. So in the end, I started with my sandbag, and then realized it was actually quicker just to use my stump, which has got a hollow in it, and just roughly beat it out into that hollow. That works really well. So you sort of bash it around. The good thing about doing it on the stump is, because it's hard, when the edges start puckering up, you can sort of shrink them into themselves as they need to. And the curvature on this is just right, that I was able to beat this out. And then to smooth it off, of course, you can put it through the wheel. You need quite a high crown wheel. Bottom die. Ooh, nearly got my fingers. And then you can smooth it off. Like that. And you get a pretty nice finish. My wheels aren't very clean, so I'm not going to get mirror finishes on everything. But that's okay, because it's all going to be sanded and painted anyway. And then this should fit up under there. Sort of go on there like that. So what I need to decide is, do I fold the edge over, in which case I might need a bit more depth on it, because when you fold that little flange around, you're going to lose a bit of height. It's a bit hard to know if it's touching or not. Or do I cut out a a ring of steel and weld this to a flat ring, which will give me a flat mounting flange all the way around. I'm not sure yet. I need to see how close it is to this. Again, this is in the lowest position, so this is the axle resting on the chassis rails basically. It won't go any lower than that, unless something's really gone wrong. But yeah, that may be enough for today. Like I say, I don't want to overdo the hammering at the moment. So I took the under tray off and made the hole bigger, and I folded up a flange on my little bowl dome thing here, and if this has gone right, I should be able to get that into there. And it's a little bit tricky because this isn't flat. There's a slight curve there, so I'm going to have to manually bend that just a little bit so it'll actually sit down flat. Hopefully there is still enough clearance. Actually, I think this, when it's bolted down, it'll sit flat. If I put sort of 6 little screws around it, that'll pull itself down. That'll be fine. So what I need to do now is jack the back of the car up again so the axle's in its lowest position and see if it touches. I've got a feeling it will, which may mean I need to increase the dome on this a little bit, which will be interesting now. I've put that flange on it. Should still be durable, it's just more stretching of the metal, but hopefully I don't need to. That's the axle sitting on the chassis bump stops, and it just fits. It's kind of scraping just a little bit, but I think that'll be fine because there is a little bit of spring in the aluminium, so if it ever bounces like that, it's just going to push it out of the way. So I think that's good. I realised you don't really actually have to jack up the back of the car because of the way the suspension works on this. You can actually lift up the chassis. It's a bit hard with one hand, but with both hands you can lift that up until the axle is sitting on the chassis. I think the dampers are set quite soft at the moment. They'll probably need tightening up a lot. On cars like this, the suspension is usually fairly stiff and the chassis flexes. So I think that'll work. Like I say, when it bolts down, I think there's enough flex in the aluminium. It's only 1.6, it's very thin. That this curve will pull out of it there. It'll just pull itself flat. I'll just weld nuts onto this, captive nuts, and then there'll just be 6 screws, the same as the screws I'm using to hold the under tray on, from underneath to pull it down. When you want to remove that to get into the diff, with the body on, you would just undo those 6 bolts. This will then come free, and then from inside the car you can just slide it out of the way. It just fits. I think that's very Brooklands, having not much clearance around anything. The good thing is, from underneath the car, the other thing is that'll catch any oil that drips from the diff, which is handy because I can see how much it leaks. And from underneath the car, it's nice and smooth. It'll finish that off really nicely. Completely flat under tray is very race car, I guess. So that should look pretty neat. It's the weekend now, And thankfully it's a bit of a wet day today, which is good because it's cooler and the garden needs the water. But I have done the third end plate, turned up the edge, and I've trimmed these now so they're all the same height. They've come out pretty well. I'll pick which two are the best two, although they're all actually pretty close, and the other one will end up being the baffle in the middle of the tank, so I need to put some holes in it, I guess. I'm not going to add any stiffening to these because I honestly don't need it. This is 1.2mm thick steel. It's very rigid, and with that edge welded all the way around, these aren't going to move. So I think trying to add those diagonal beads in there, all I'm going to do is add distortion to these. I'd rather keep them flat. The original tanks were just flat on the ends. There's a little bit of crown to them. This is an original saloon tank here. You can see how they had to put in a piece to clear the diff. These are just kind of, they just kind of have a slight bit of crown to them. I do need to sort out some tubing for the filler neck. I think I want that to be about 3-inch diameter. This stuff's too thick, even though it's not the right diameter anyway. What I'm thinking is a piece of exhaust tube. So, because that's actually fairly thin, this would be too big. What size is that? This is, so that's 4-inch tube. 3-inch would be about there, and that's about right. This is also exhaust tube. This exhaust pipe, it's basically aluminium covered steel, I think. Good thing is it's easy to weld, of course. So that's 2.5, and that's probably too small. 3 will be about right. So I just need to go to an exhaust place, and I'm sure they'll give me 1/2 meter of 3-inch pipe, no problem. And I need to do the filler cap, and I'm wondering what to do for that. This is 3-inch. So what I'm wondering is, can I fabricate something aluminium cap, because the original caps they're like a simple aluminium block like this with ears and sort of ball ends, so like dog bone type thing. So same as for a radiator. So this is a radiator one, but they're kind of like this, but with an aluminium and for a petrol cap. So I don't think I could use this because it's actually, I almost could use that. I would have to machine a matching thread there, and if the end of the pipe had a cap on it with the right thread, I suppose that would be doable, but it's not quite. Well, it is 3 inches across there, so that would be a possibility. But this one's a radiator cap. Not sure what I would do about the hole. Either plug it up, I guess, or fit something into it, a little copper coil or something. I do need to check what the rules say about these cars. With these petrol tanks, it says they're not supposed to spill if you tip over. If you tip over in that, you're really in trouble. So I have to figure out what that means, or how that'll work, because of course the tank will need a small vent somewhere, because if you're sucking fuel out of it, you don't want it sealed. It won't, you'll end up sucking a vacuum and it won't pull the fuel through. But I'll get to that anyway. Remember, this tank's fairly short because it has to fit into there. So I'm not sure where my mock-up is. Over here somewhere. Really crappy tape. So you can see it's shorter than this table. So by the time you've got these either end and another one in the middle, it's baffled in the middle, it's going to be very, very rigid, because these are only short lengths. To trim the edge, I used these cutters. These are Milwaukee ones, and I think it was Metal Shaper Tom who recommended these. He showed using these. These are really good because they're sort of cranked. They're a bit, I find them a bit tough to use sometimes, but that just could be because my hands are sore. And they are good though. They feel really nice when you're using them. And when you're cutting, when I was trimming this, I need to dress that edge a little, you can feel the difference between cutting on the straight where the metal's just folded up to cutting on the curve where it's been shrunk to get it to come up, and you can feel that you're cutting through thicker metal. It's only going to be fractionally thicker. I could measure it with a micrometer, I guess, but it doesn't really matter. But definitely with these, you can feel as you trim it that it's harder to trim where you've shrunk the metal and made it thicker. So that's where I'm at with that. I think I mentioned I'd finished the little dish. I just need to weld some nuts onto it. So that'll fit in there. And what's next? I would really like to, I need to pull out the metal bar for the seatbelt mounts, the bar across there and the one at the front, and paint those. I think I'd mentioned I had previously painted some of these. It's just good anti-rust enamel paint. It goes on nice and hard. I find it takes a couple of weeks really to properly dry. It's probably actually taking longer than that, but once it is really dry, it's good solid stuff. And if you need to touch it up again later, you can just do that from spray cans. What else do I need to do? At some point I need to figure out the little storage compartments that go under there. I might make those separate little compartments, or separate little trays that just drop in rather than trying to build something into the floors as they are. Maybe I can just use very thin plywood, or maybe just thin aluminium, and just bend up some little trays, because it's tricky to do with one hand. You don't just want to put things loose in here because they'll get caught up in the brake mechanism. So I need to put something in here just to separate this out. So goes in like that. The other thing I remembered I need to do on the chassis, it is getting close to being able to be stripped down and painted, is I need to figure out, I need to put the body back on to see where the bonnet's going to come to, and there's aluminium trim pieces that sit on here to fill this in basically. So I'll need a couple of holes on this just to mount those flat panels. And then I think that should be all the holes I need in the chassis. Oh, I do need to drill and pin those just to make sure those rear suspension mounts can't move. They shouldn't anyway because they're sort of attached to the springs, but yeah, those need to be pinned through, and that should be it. So getting closer to what I would hope is painting the chassis and kind of final assembly. I'm still working on the petrol tank. The day's lined up, which is good, but we had enough rain that I was able to check that the Land Rover wasn't leaking, and so far so good. It seemed like the new seals are doing the trick. And I 3D printed some little covers that go over the mechanism, so you can't refit the handles at the moment unless you pull those covers off. Just finishes it off. I don't really need to open the sunroofs, I just don't want them to leak. But on the petrol tank I just cut a couple of holes. I literally just traced around my little dolly. So that's for the baffle, that'll go in the middle, hole at the bottom, hole at the top. That should be enough to let the fuel move between the two halves. And I should really move the slip rollers over so I can start making the outside part. But I got distracted and I thought I'll try and save my hands from too much hammering. And I thought, why not use this what's obviously a radiator cap, dog bone thing. I could use that as the fuel filler neck. There's no reason why I can't. I gave it a good clean and I thought it was steel, but it turns out it's actually brass, so it's a solid brass piece. It was nickel plated. Some of the plating has come off, so I should be able to replate that. And I still need to figure out what to do about the little hole in the middle. I can just block that off, I think. Although I am thinking it's actually quite handy if I can come up with a way of, maybe if I thread that and have another little boss thing that goes in there, that would be really useful for then being able to dip a dip stick into the fuel tank, because that's the only way I've got to measure the actual volume of petrol in there. So I'm going to make up a calibrated stick. So that would be a handy way of being able to push that in without needing to actually take the cap off. I've decided I will use a 3-inch tube, so that's about the right diameter. That is basically the same as this is 3-inch, and I'm sure I can get a piece of 3-inch exhaust tube to make the filler neck. Obviously that's not 3-inch, that turns out to be a 2-inch thread on there. I measured this up. I have no idea what car this came off. This came from a little second-hand shop in Wellington. I think it was $25, something like that. I measured up the thread, and this must have come off some kind of British car because it seems to be a Whitworth thread. So it's a 16 TPI thread. As much as I could, I measured the angle on the threads, and they do seem to be Whitworth threaded. So I found a piece of steel. It's a disc of steel. This is actually just under 3 inches, so it's close enough. This is one of the blanks that I used to make the rear shock mounts. I had those cut by an engineering shop. I didn't have a way of cutting them myself, and I didn't have the steel. So I ended up buying these, and I got a couple of extras because I expected to mess up the suspension mounts, but I didn't. So I still got the extra one, and I've put that in the lathe, and I set the lathe up for a 16 TPI thread, which on this lathe is always a pain in the neck. You have to change the gears around. Obviously it's all done manually. You have to go by this little chart, and it's quite confusing getting the right ratios. But I got that set up, 16 TPI, and I'm doing a single point internal thread cut. And it's not a blind hole, but you do have to be careful because this is sitting in the chuck. I've got it off the sitting off the jaws. I squared it all up and got it sitting off the jaws so that there's room behind there that this doesn't crash into the chuck. But you can see there's only less than 1/8 of an inch there probably, so I have to be really careful. But all the little modifications I've done on this lathe since I got it have really helped with this. So the gear set I'm using isn't the proper one for this lathe. This was another cheap Chinese gear set that I bored out the middles and added the little slot on them. They work fine, so I haven't come across a thread I haven't been able to cut yet with this gear set. The dial indicator is another cheap from China, modified to work type thing. That works really well. I can never remember what numbers it's okay to engage the threads on. So this is a 16 TPI one, which I think it means you can use any position. I would always have to go and look that up to understand how that works. So I just don't bother. I just have one line and I just let it go all the way around. It's not the most efficient way to do it, but I know it works. That's why one of the marks there has a little bit of red Sharpie on it, because that's the one I was using. And just a single point internal cutting tool. And the digital readout really helps, because to cut this thread, of course, you have the angle set up on the top here, and I think that angle, have I got that angle wrong? No, that should be right. You feed in the cutting tool here on this angle, so it's feeding against the cutting face. It's only cutting on one face. You're not trying to plunge this into the thread because it's too much load on the tool. And I'm only moving sort of a thou at a time, so it took quite a while. So you engage it, let it cut, and then you have to wind it out of the way with this. And because this is hooked up to the DRO, it made it really easy for me to wind it in and then wind it back to zero every time. And I've been checking, because obviously you can use the dial down here as well, and it's spot on. So these are working really well. Yeah, the first magnetic one not so good, but these seem to work much better. And so now I have a metal ring with the right thread on it that I can then weld to the filler neck. So the only other problem was I tend to do these threads, I figure out I can't remember which dimension it is, the major or the minor. I figure out one of them, and then the other one, theoretically you can work out how deep it needs to be, how far you have to feed it in, but I find it's easier to just do test fits when you get close, and then just take really small cuts. Of course, the problem with doing that here is I can't just spin this part on because of the dog bone part. It's too big to fit in my lathe, so it meant every test fit I had to rotate the chuck, and because I've got this on the slowest speed, that's actually quite hard to do because it's so low geared. But eventually I've got it to the point where this actually threads on really nicely. So you'll just have to believe me, because I can't do it with one hand, and it's not quite at the point where it's engaging. You have to be careful you don't cross thread it. To avoid that, you usually put this on and rotate it backwards. This works with bolts as well, until you feel the thread sort of drop down, and then you know you're engaged in it properly. This isn't in the right position that I can get that to work. So I think what I'll do now is I'll just clean up the faces. I'll just take a quick pass on those, and that should be done. Cleaned up the faces on this. The other thing worth mentioning is when you're doing that single point cutting and you have to do those test fits, it's easy to forget that you've got a sharp tool sitting right there. So I've got a few holes in my knuckles from whacking into that thing. But this works quite nicely. It threads on there really well. I'm really pleased with how that came out. It's very satisfying when you're doing threading like this, and it actually works out nicely and ends up being just the right fit. So wind it backwards. Oh, it's a bit hard. I'd need to clamp it in the vise or something, but normally you can rotate that backwards, and you'll hear the threads engage as it drops down into the thread, and then you know you can wind it on. Oh, can I do it with one hand? But this does thread on nicely if you use both hands. Like that. I might give this a little bit of a clean. I might just put it in the nickel plating solution. I just want to see if I can actually get nickel to stick to this. I don't mind it how it is. It's got a nice sort of patina to it, to be honest. So that'll probably just stay like that. And when the fuel tank is done, this actually sticks out through the boot lid. So this sits up here, which does mean to get into the boot you have to take the petrol filler cap off. And that's one of the reasons why you don't want to make this bigger than the tube. You want the tube to be straight all the way up and down, because then your boot lid can have a nice tight fitting hole. I think there's usually sort of a ring and a sort of leather gasket around it to give you a little bit of weather sealing, even though weather sealing on a car like this makes not a lot of sense. But at least it stops too much water getting in there. So I think that's where I'm going to finish for the day. Next thing to do will be probably bring the slip rollers over. Oh, hello Milo. So I can actually start doing the outside of the tank, forming that.